Welcome to our pod. And by that, I mean on Wednesdays we read. I'm Hannah.
I'm Laura.
And we are two best friends who usually do a deep dive into a new book series, one book at a time. But today we are three
best
friends.
friends.
Because we are welcoming to the podcast Steve Hugh Westenra to discuss the epic film of Jennifer Lopez, The Cell from 2000. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you for having me.
We are so excited to have you on this podcast. This came about via Blue Sky, everyone. So we made a joke on Blue Sky that I recently made my sister-in-law watch 2 Jennifer Lopez movies and talked about it on the podcast. And Steve was amazing and immediately Blue Sky chatted us. I don't know what it's called. Is it called like Sky messaged?
I think they say skeet, but
Skeet.
I don't like that.
Oh,
the problem with skeet is like it's a derogatory term where I'm from for like it's like chav. Like it's like the same word as chav.
Oh
so
my
like
gosh.
whenever I'm like I need to call it something, but like I just can't bring myself to call it skeet. Like it just immediately
Well, you clouded us. Like
I clouded you.
Yeah, you clouded us.
Steve responded to my initial post and was like, "Did you guys talk about The Cell?"
Yes.
And I was like, "No, but do we need to?"
Yeah.
And then Laura was like, "Oh, Laura tweeted at clouded you," and I immediately pulled up a view of the Cell, and I was like, "Oh, this is a trippy movie, and I have no idea what it's about, but we're definitely watching it." And so here we are. But Steve, can you tell us a little bit about your history with The Cell and why you clouded us about it?
Awesome. Yeah. So I think on Blue Sky specifically, I call myself a Cell evangelist.
You
which I think
did.
is pretty accurate. Like I really want to tell everyone the good news about this movie that came out like 25 years ago. Eep. So I watched this when I was quite young. So I was born in 1986. So I was like some teenage age when that happened. I'm not very good at math. And so myself and my friend saw it, and I was just like racking my brain earlier trying to remember anymore if I saw it in theaters or not. And I actually don't think I did. I think my two friends and I, it was one of many films that her parents rented, and then like we all ran over there the next day to sort of like, get a watch in sort of before it was brought back to the video store. Um, and I think it just like imprinted itself on our brains. We all had this like really intense live action role play that we played together, like freeform role play, where different characters like inhabited our bodies and like things like that. And like it was just role playing, but um like often the kinds of like characters that would populate this role play were like demons and things like that that had this fantastical element to them. And I think kind of the visual language of the cell and a lot of the themes that it's working with and playing with and the kind of content, I suppose, of the movie really influenced how we told stories to each other. And that subsequently impacted then how I wrote stories and a lot of the kind of like visual stuff that I try to do in my own work. I think it owes a lot to the director Tarsem Singh. So yeah, like I definitely, nothing but a positive relationship with this movie. Other subsequent funny story, I guess. So like I'm an academic, and when I was doing this one grad class as part of my PhD program, and it was all about sort of like can't remember the exact course. It was might have been Christianity and sexuality or something like that, or one of the other ones. But in any case, I really wanted to like force my class to watch The Cell, but I wasn't allowed to because it was a horror film. And I still ended up sort of incorporating a discussion of the movie and its imagery in the talk I did for that class. And it was all about sort of Marian imagery and that kind of stuff, specifically in like a horror context. And the first words out of my mouth when the slide came on for The Cell were like, I have to describe the plot to everybody. So I was like, Jennifer Lopez is the psychologist. And my instructor burst out laughing. Like, she's like, I'm sorry, I can't take this seriously. Like, and I was like, she's really good though. She's really good at it. Trust me. Like, yeah, she's actually really good. And yeah, like Yeah, I always think of Jennifer Lopez first as an actress because she was an actress when I was young and then went into singing. So like, bit of a different perspective maybe. But anyway, I guess that's my history with the cell is just its visuals really impacted me. A lot of the themes around sort of like cycles of abuse and stuff really impacted me. Yeah. Hopefully
No,
that
that's
helps.
amazing. And I have talked to Steve before. You have been on one of our author highlights over on the blog, and I know that you're a
Yeah.
huge fan of horror. So it's exciting
Yeah.
to get you on like with the science fiction psych horror like mix. I think
Yeah.
that that's a great. I'm very excited for this episode. So,
Yay.
uh, Laura, can you tell us about your history or lack thereof with the cell?
So my experience is Steve told me we should watch this movie, and I watched it just a couple days ago, and
Excellent.
enjoyed it a lot. Like I was watching it, and I texted Hannah a little confusedly because I was like, "Are we supposed to not like this movie? Because I like this movie. Like I'm a little confused. I think this is a good movie." But then I went and just looked at Jennifer Lopez's filmography on Wikipedia because I was curious, like, how
Mm.
many Jennifer Lopez movies have I watched? And I
Hmm.
haven't, in fact, watched the three that were in a row right here in that 1999 to 2001 sphere of Ants, The Cell, and The Wedding Planner. She did those movies back to back. I've watched all of those. As well as if we jump ahead to 2004, 2005, I've watched Shall We Dance and Monster in Law. And that concludes my Jennifer Lopez movie viewing
Nice.
experience.
To
Amazing.
be
Hannah,
to
what
be
about you?
Oh,
oh,
no, go ahead. Steve, did you have something?
I was just gonna say, to be fair, if you've seen The Cell, you've basically seen The Wedding Planner. I mean,
Yeah,
you don't
I
need
mean,
to
The same
bother.
thing.
it's the same
Yeah.
thing. She just, you set off Mike. She just keeps getting typecast.
Exactly.
And Ants is really just like the animated version of it. It's just, they're all so
Yeah.
similar.
Yeah.
So I grew up in a very female motivated household where we mostly watched rom-coms at all times. So if there is a
Uh-huh.
rom-com from about 1995 to 2010, I would say I've seen it, a lot of them. So I'd never seen The Cell. I'm actually a huge baby when it comes to horror, but I've weirdly in my adulthood become like more intrigued with it, where I read a lot more horror
Hmm.
than I ever have before in my life. And I think I'm getting into the motifs of horror, and they've become like more like something I identify with or something I'm interested in studying more as I go on. I will say that I am still a huge baby where sometimes I'm like, that was scary and I don't know if I'll sleep tonight. But
Aw.
I feel like this was an exciting experience because this was also my first time experiencing it. But I've been reading a lot more horror over the last couple of years. So it's exciting to like actually see a psychological horror and see like how different it could be and artistic it could be, because I did say this feels like a very artistically horrifying movie.
Yeah.
But when it comes to J Lo or Vince Vaughn, I have mostly seen their rom coms, which is how this all started. Was I play a game online called Movie Grid, and a lot of times Jennifer Lopez pops up on it, and I know
Okay.
quite a few Jennifer Lopez movies, like The Wedding Planner, and Enough, the movie where she is trying to escape her abusive husband and he becomes a
Okay.
villain in the second half, and Made in Manhattan, Jersey Girl, Monster in Law. I've seen like all of those. And so it's very much like, oh, I've seen like most of her rom-coms and then nothing else. So it was a big joke in my household because no one else had ever seen Jennifer Lopez movies, and I had seen so many, and this was a blind spot for me. So, but I also enjoyed it, Steve. This was an excellent addition to Laura and I, because I feel like neither
Yay.
one of us are huge horror aficionados. So where does this like stand for you on horror? Is it kind of just like a little light but artistic, or like how does it speak to you as someone who, loves horror?
So I tend to take a fairly like capacious view of horror generally. Which means I just like I tend to let more in than I exclude, or I prefer, to let more stories sort of occupy that genre category than I would exclude. Which, like I'm sure there are people who are going to take issue with that, for sure. There's a lot of contentious, kind of nasty sometimes arguing. As you guys are very familiar with, like literally any genre online,
Yeah.
there's people like, that's
Yeah.
not a romance. It doesn't have ducks. Um, you know, That
If there's not a
frequent
scene
like
by the water or in the rain,
ah.
it can't be a romance.
Exactly. Um, so like that kind of stuff, or like or just like attempts to exclude people more
Mhm.
often, like certain types of people or certain kinds of a certain kind of feel that a story might have. So I prefer not to do that, particularly when I'm analyzing something. I think because it almost like it robs us of the ability to kind of like consider the thing in and of itself first and understand what its relationship is to shifts and changes in how we're perceiving genre. Because I think genre is very much like it's a tool that we use. Sometimes in some spheres, it's a marketing tool very specifically to let people know, okay, you've got to shelve this book in the romance section so that
Mhm.
people know where to buy it. But other times, just for the purposes of kind of the author or the audience being able to map something, I think, and know sort of like how it relates to other works that have preceded it. But as soon as something ceases to be a useful tool, I think like that's where you want to throw it out. Like if something starts dictating the rules instead of being the thing which is changed by shifting trends that are happening naturally, that's the point at which I start to get kind of worried that we're being very dogmatic. And I feel that way about categories in general across the board, not even just in genre, like in terms of talking about fiction. Um, but that said, I think so yeah, like I consider The Cell to be horror. I think like Hannah, you really made a good point that it's very much a psychological horror in a lot of ways, just for the basic fact that it's sort of like um concerned with and thinking about psychology, right? At a very
Mhm.
basic level, it's about this sort of futuristic, quasi-ridiculous like technology that allows people to go inside the minds or dreams of others, that we don't have or don't have yet. Perhaps shouldn't have, perhaps that would be a bad thing. Um, and all of the kinds of nightmares that would naturally come from that. Um, so there's that psychological piece there that's dealing both with the psychology of the person entering someone else's mind, the psychology of the person being entered, and then also the psychology of the audience, who are also kind of um, an eyewitness on sort of like, what's happening.
No,
On another level, I think like if you wanted to call it something like, art house horror or whatever, you
mm,
definitely could. Because as you guys both point out, it's really got this like intense visual eye
yeah.
to it. Yeah, like very strong aesthetically. And that I think is, what's going to like make it stand out from a lot of like the kind of almost copycat Seven type movies
Mm.
and Silence of the Lamb type movies that were kind of, par for the course in the late 90s, early 2000s. Like
Which are
this
also
one
some of
stands
my
out.
favorite ones. So I'm like, yep, those are right
I
there.
mean,
So
it does have similarities to those types of movies as
Oh
well.
yeah.
And there's
Oh yeah.
definitely very much like that almost like thriller aspect to this where it's like we got
Yes.
to hurry up and find this person before they have to put the lotion in the basket or whatever.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I feel like there's very much like that kind of feel to this movie, but done in a fresher way.
yeah.
Yeah.
So this movie, for people who haven't seen The Cell, what are you doing? Go watch it because it's going to be very hard to
Yeah.
describe because it is a very visual film.
Hmm.
Uh, and for horror, I would say it is on the lighter side of horror. I
Yeah,
was
I would
able
say
to watch
lighter.
it and I wasn't too scared during it. So, but it
I think if
follows,
you can handle SVU, you can
yeah,
handle
this.
Yeah,
this
I mean,
movie.
there's a little physical like ew because you see like
Hmm. Hmm.
some rings hanging in someone's back and they're like suspended and it's a
and
little
Yeah.
some
bit yuck.
there's some intestines in this one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But we
But that's about as
follow,
bad as it gets.
Yeah.
but the movie kind of opens with J-Lo in this very like in a desert where she's riding this horse and then it like becomes fake and she walks for like half a mile. I did say during this, I was watching it with my sister-in-law. We both were like, I mean, it seems like she could have ridden the horse for a little while longer. She's walking for a while. um,
Didn't
but
plan that well.
yeah, but she like walks up to this little boy and they have this conversation. And during it, she asks to like go sailing. And he says he's afraid of this moklok. And during it, like he becomes like monstrous. And then she wakes up and we find out that this is a little bit more futuristic because this is a virtual reality treatment. She's a child psychologist, and she's trying to help this patient who's in a coma, and he's not really making any steps. He was left comatose by a viral infection that was caused by an unusual form of schizophrenia. And then we're kind of doing an interspersing cutscene where I didn't actually know much about this movie. And I was kind of like, how are these interrelated? Because it was a little confusing because you have this serial killer who is going to his secret lair where a woman has been drowned, and he's kind of like manipulating the body and interacting with the body. And then the FBI identifies him after he uh, kidnaps one more victim, and she's still missing. And then he has the same schizophrenic illness, and he also falls into a coma. And they ask this group to have J-Lo enter his mind to see if they can find out where this last victim is. And then
in order to save her.
And then we get into the mind of a serial killer, and it's very mixed, and it's very like visual. So you get to see just all these different like nightmares or living dreams. And of course, there are stakes where if J-Lo forgets that she's in a dream, she could get stuck there. And Vince Vaughn might have to come save her, who is the FBI agent.
Vince Vaughn is the FBI, and Vincent D'Onofrio is a serial killer. I mean, things are happening.
Also, like young Vincent D'Onofrio, where I was like, I didn't know he was that much of like
He's
a good-looking
so
guy.
many things. So many things.
And then Jake Thomas as the young Vincent D'Onofrio, who is from the Lizzie McGuire TV shows.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh my God.
I saw him and I was like, Lizzie McGuire, brother, what are you doing here? So
yeah, little did you know, he actually is a serial killer. And
what an added layer when you're watching Lizzie McGuire now.
Didn't hear about where are they now?
Right. Yes. But through it all, like there's a lot of twists and turns. There's, J-Lo deciding she has to save this serial killer because there's a small child inside of him who is
because
what
ends up happening essentially is when she goes into the mind of the serial killer, whose name is Carl Starger, she basically ends up encountering these different versions of him. And one of these is this really like evil, twisted person who is like the absolute worst possible version of Starger. But then she's also able to encounter the child version of him who is kind of like leading her through his experiences in his life and showing her like, oh, hey, this is what happened to me at this point, or watch out because this is going to happen. And she sees the abuse and the horrible things that he encountered in his life. And so she develops a deep empathy for this child version of this serial killer, and she ends up wanting to save the child in this situation. And it's an interesting portrayal because I think we often try to associate like a person that is always the same their whole life, and I think it's interesting to look at the things that shape us to make us who we are, but also recognizing that like those are separate people. Like him in the future is not the person he was then. So I thought that was really a unique way to portray that.
Yeah.
No,
this was a really interesting movie because it was a lot of twists and turns, but it's also just so psychological because you are just in the mind of someone. And I think it does a really effective job at showing what the mind looks like especially in dreams, or where it's just like there are these fantastical moments where you're just not questioning anything because it's inside your head. So it was very interesting to see all those different things interacting with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting too, like, because we're seeing young Starger, and then we've got sort of like, what's called like King Starger, so the really like nasty fellow who appears and has like the cape and the cool scene with the
oh my
purple
gosh, the cape
very
was
cool.
such a cool scene.
Such a cool scene. Who's really, really nasty. And he's essentially the sort of embodiment or manifestation of kind of Starger's own boogeyman in a way. But also this aspirational figure that he would like to be, who's able to kind of chase away the abusive phantom of his father, right? And then sort of course, third, you've got the sort of like actual Starger who like kind of appears as an adult and narrates a lot of what's happening to Jennifer Lopez, her character Catherine. And I think it's such an interesting way to do it because it's not just this is literally the child that she's interacting with. It's said in the movie itself, it's rather Starger's adult perspective on
Hmm.
what
Hmm.
that child was like. And sort of
Yes.
it comes to represent this part of him that he perceives as being pure or innocent,
Hmm.
and is desperately trying to protect. And that
Yeah.
sort of like recurring motif of like innocence, of cleanliness, of like, purity kind of like comes up and again, and it's sort of like mirrored in the visual imagery of the movie, the colors,
Hmm.
like everything that's going on. So I find that really interesting, that kind of psychological piece. It's not just about sort of like the reality of somebody, it's about, someone's imagined reality of themselves, then filtered through the film and filtered through the audience. And it's very kind of not metafictional in that kind of like almost like cloying, irritating way that kind of started to develop. But it is sort of like it's a movie that I think plays into the fact that it's a story
Hmm.
and that it's a story about stories and about stories we tell ourselves about
Yes.
ourselves, if
Yes.
that's
I was
not
just gonna
too
say
like,
that yeah, it's all about the way that we perceive our own stories, really.
Which
yeah.
they did do a really effective job. This movie is rather quick. It is 107 minutes. Like you do
Hmm.
Yeah.
not
Perfect movie
and
length, honestly.
I did
Yeah.
argue that I felt like they could have cut out the last 10 minutes because I'm not sure we needed the serial killer to be like redeemed in certain ways, but like I understood it as a storytelling motif. But I do think they did a really effective job of having the real world kind of show you the stakes, but like not
Right.
just tell you. It was like all part of the story where like they do full back and they are like Jennifer Lopez. Don't get too close. I'm not going to call her Catherine because it's just
That's
Jennifer
okay.
Lopez.
Yeah, yeah. She's just Jennifer Lopez.
It's
Yeah.
just Jennifer Lopez. They're like
She's
talking
just
to
Jenny from the block.
exactly.
Come on.
Um, there was a very sad moment where I watched Selena before I watched this movie, and she has a
Mhm.
fake Southern accent. And I was like, oh, that she's dipping out of that accent so often. And my sister-in-law goes, where's she from? And I was like, I don't know, Florida. And I was like, she is obviously Jenny from the block. I should have known that. But like the doctors around her talking to her and being like, hey, this isn't a real person. This is just a part of him. And it's even filtered through it. And they're like, adding the stakes, but they're doing it in a really effective way where it's not just like repeating anything, like it's adding
Yeah,
layers to the actual storytelling.
yeah, yeah, very much so. Yeah, I think, it's there's a lot that it's playing like you guys already brought it up too, but just sort of that I think it's doing in that it's undermining a kind of like confident view that I think we want to have, or particularly I would say also that people in the 90s were starting to kind of have, um, about sort of like what makes a monster, or we were all very deeply fascinated by sort of like serial killer psychology, these kinds of things.
Mhm.
And I do think it's sort of poking a little bit at that to sort of like uncover a little bit of the process of how these things happen, like what a sort of like authentic psychology of somebody who's able to commit these crimes would be like, and particularly to kind of highlight like the reality of like cycles of abuse, what they can do in certain circumstances. Obviously not all. Most victims of abuse don't go on to abuse other people, but it does sometimes happen, and it can be a contributing factor in that. And so, trying to evoke, I think, an empathy for people early on in their lives, and to kind of caution against um and understanding that like, well, someone was always destined to become this. Like
Mhm.
there was never a way that they wouldn't have become this. And I think the movie does kind of try to kind of complicate that a little bit. Which you kind of see in that conversation
Mhm.
with Jennifer Lopez and Vince Vaughn as well, like when they're he kind of takes the opposite view and says, well, like basically a monster is a monster. And she says, well, I don't know, like, if you'd kind of seen some of the things or had the experiences I've had as a psychologist, as a care worker, because she mentions that she's sort of worked with foster care, I think it is, or
Yeah.
Yeah.
social work. Yeah, then you'd recognize that sort of like there are contributing factors to people's behavior, right? Like, Yeah.
But I also think in that scene, it hints that Vince Vaughn might have been the victim of like domestic abuse or,
Right.
I
some type of
wondered
abuse.
something about that as well, but they never really like explored it at all. They kind of just left it
Yeah.
there.
I think I'm okay with more reading between the lines on that though, because he was just
Yeah.
so forceful with his opinion. You could see like it mattered to him. And so
Hmm.
it's
Yeah.
even if it's just like due to his experience, I think it was one where it was like, oh, the person who's watching can interpret and read into it what they see. But like that moment was really big because Vince Vaughn is like, no, that you are not, who you are because of your bad experiences. Like that's not like there are so many people who have this happen to them who don't go on to be
Who don't
serial
do this?
killers. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought that
Yeah.
was
Hmm.
it was an important note to show like why Jennifer Lopez had a different view, but also why she might fall more victim to wanting to be in his mind or speak with the young Starger and things like that.
For sure. Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I also thought it was interesting too. This is like kind of switching topics a little bit, but how Vince Vaughn brought up a traumatic event that happened to her in order to wake her
Mm.
from
Mm.
that situation. I thought that that was kind of a unique and somewhat moving way to do that rather than just like coming in and being like, remember who you are from like
Yeah.
Mufasa, you know, like
This
I
isn't real.
Yeah.
like Simba, remember who you are, pinch yourself. And I thought it was just like a really unique way to do that where it's like, yeah, we sometimes have to be reminded of the pain and trauma and things that we undergo in order to like bring ourselves back to reality.
Right. Yeah. And that this traumatic experience of hers, which is the death of her younger brother, can be a kind of grounding
Mhm.
thing because
Hmm.
it's not something she would, I suppose one could imagine it and like in the form of a nightmare, that sort of thing, but it's so sharp.
Mhm.
Maybe something she doesn't want to think about that it's able to kind of pull her out again.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, and it shows like why she feels a need to be connected to young men
Yes,
in a coma, like
Yeah.
where
absolutely.
it gives her
Yeah.
that. And I think that that also shows like when she and Vince Vaughn are discussing it, and she's like, "Well, bad things that happen can affect you," and it's like and they are talking about themselves in a certain way where they're each coming with their own perspective on it. So,
Yeah, and I like that too because it's like neither of them are wrong. It's just
right.
unique experiences bring each of them to where they are.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that's definitely very true. Yeah, like it's kind of interesting the piece about like her needing to be jolted out of the dream by the particular information. So like there's not very many interviews available with Tara Singh, the director, online, and particularly not ones about the cell. But one of the ones I did find, like originally it was actually a different thing that pulls her out. So like this is quite dark. So it's just like but originally it was supposed the fact that she is given by Vince Vaughn is actually like, when you were in college you had an abortion.
Oh,
And
Okay.
yeah, they changed it for American, like, because they thought American audiences would respond negatively to it, presumably because they thought it would make them dislike her as a character.
yeah.
Um, I like in terms of like that makes me viscerally react and be like, oh, I want to be on the side of keeping it, but at the same time, I actually think the coma thing makes more sense
Yeah.
Hmm.
because it provides a through line as to, like you said, why she's so
The
invested.
connection.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think I understand from like a motivation of like you should just trust people to dislike or like characters, but I also think like uh, that is a very stark thing to just have Vince Vaughn, a man she just met, talk about. Like
Well,
that's a very
right.
random
and
thing
I'm just
to
thinking
bring
too, just
up.
like you said, like it doesn't necessarily make sense with the rest of the storyline. Like, yes, it would be a traumatic thing, but like it doesn't necessarily make sense with the
Right.
rest of the story.
Well, and also for some people, it's not traumatic. So it's
Yeah,
kind of reading
Yeah.
true,
into it in a
true.
very specific way of like, um, I do think I prefer the brother in a coma because like that is
Yeah.
it's a grief and
Yeah.
it's a loss of someone who's like familial, and that makes a lot more sense. Where like it's like, well, she chose to do that. That is something
In
different.
a
So
very
Yeah.
similar situation. So yeah, it
yeah,
it it just kind of makes more sense for her character as to why, like you said, Hannah, she would be attached to them.
yeah.
Yeah.
I will say that this movie falls into bad psychologist tropes. Like
Yeah.
I'm the biggest like because I'm a former attorney. I'm like really nitpicky about certain
Nice.
professions.
Oh,
And
awesome.
I lived with a psychologist for a really long time. And so there is a scene in this movie where the doctor is talking to Vince Vaughn and he's like, we looked at other doctors and they would just observe and give us
Yeah.
and give us feedback on what's going on with the child. I was like, you mean like probably ethically what they should be doing?
Probably
Like,
do their job and not
like,
violate
how
patients.
dare they do their job? Like, what are we talking
Oh.
about here?
Yeah.
I did find that very funny, and also the movie's interesting because it does bring up a lot of like ethical questions in a very quick
Yes.
movie.
Mhm.
And there are questions there about the ethical like violations of going into someone's dreams or being a part of them. And they do discuss that. And they also discuss like J-Lo is not the most effective psychologist because she has a lot of personal feelings that are getting in her way.
Yeah.
And one of them is like she's really pushing to have the child enter her mind. And like
Yeah.
during the movie, they bring up like, well, you are a consenting participant and you're going into
Yes.
someone else's world as a consenting participant. So it's okay, but we're not
Yeah.
going to do this to this young child who did
Mhm.
not and does not understand what is happening to him.
You
And then
may
at the
not
end of the
understand
movie,
he's in a coma. Like that's made
right.
unclear in the movie, right? So
And
yeah, yeah.
and she's like, at the end of the movie, she learns that she's definitely going to bring that kid into her mind. And I was like,
Yeah.
I think I'm on the side of ethics here. Like, let's not take this small child into your brain, J Lo.
Yeah. I think
Um,
especially because there's no like third party who's then monitoring it. I think because like,
right,
Yeah.
if she's the only one observing this, the child can't report any, like there's just a lot of like for the purposes of the movie and the story, we're seeing what's happening. So we're kind of like taking it at face value, like, okay,
right.
she's correct and this is great. But like it's all beautiful. There's a boat in a tree and there's a blue scarf that's waves. But like if you think about it, if you take it out of the movie for any length of time, it's like, oh God, like
Well, I mean,
no.
if we're getting even more nitpicky, Hannah, like we could just say, like, yeah, she probably would have been fired for locking them all out of the
Right.
room
Yeah,
and
yeah, for
just
sure.
going back into Starker's mind.
Oh,
And then, oh, wait, you were trapped in there because you ended up in a really bad situation and someone had to go in to save you. Yeah, you're obviously not going to be continuing with the company.
so I'm also going to caveat this with I very much enjoyed this movie, and I think not all movies need to be like 100% on the up and up.
Oh, for
But we
sure.
did make a
Yeah.
lot of jokes about how this movie was just a lot of people who are ineffective at their jobs
Yeah.
because J Lo is not the most effective. She is not asking for ethical things. She's not observing. She's not doing that.
Yeah.
The other doctors are not doing their best to like check in with her during a very
No.
traumatic events, and they're like
Yeah.
not putting their foot down in ways.
Yeah.
Well,
And
the way that they're just like, we need to check in on Vince Vaughn after he just did that, and then they're just like, whatever,
J Lo's fine.
she's fine.
Yeah.
She's done it before. He's
Yeah.
but I also made the joke that like Carl this the serial killer is not very effective at his job because he gets caught immediately because they're like he's getting sloppy. He wants to get caught. And I'm like,
Yeah.
he's not really covering his tracks anymore. Like he's driving around
Yeah.
a car that's registered to him with his albino dog, which is very findable.
Yeah.
So he's not doing an effective job. And then the FBI in this movie
They're really fucking
jump
useless.
jump
Yes.
really quick to let's enter this man's dreams when I'm like, actually, if you guys had just done detective work, you could have found out like so a huge part of this
I
movie
kind of
is
thought that too. Couldn't they have looked into like properties he owned or something like that?
so
Like,
throughout this movie, a huge thing is at the beginning of the movie, they go to his home and there's like this equipment, industrial equipment there
Yeah.
uh with this like brand name on it.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
then when Vince Vaughn enters the dream, he sees the brand name on a piece of something in there. And he's like, I look into this brand name.
And that's how
And
they
then
find the woman.
and then they find the woman because he is the person who was charged with cleaning out this industrial place that went bankrupt and no one's there anymore. And I was like,
Yeah.
well, that's just plain old detective work. Like if you
Yeah.
saw an industrial
Yes.
machine in his basement, you actually could have just done that and then found her. Like
My
it's
mom
just
was making fun of that throughout the movie. So like I watched that with her the other day before I even knew we were doing this. I was like, I wasn't feeling well. I was like, I want to watch The Cell. So we went down and watched The Cell. It was a comfort film. And yeah, and she hadn't seen it before it turned out. I thought she had, and like she was complaining about this throughout the movie. It was like, and especially where like in the scene where they initially go down into his basement and they kind of enter this, like other realm, like his safe
yeah.
space, I guess. Save serial killer space. Um, like they make a point. The camera makes a point of focusing on the symbol of this machine, which is called
Mm-hmm.
Carver, and it's a cool
Hmm.
like kind of esoteric-y looking symbol. Um, and like we see Vince Vaughn focus on that symbol, and then
Mm-hmm.
they take photos of it and they measure it. Like they know it's like this is significant, and then like they don't presumably, I guess, then do anything with it. Like whereas
That
like
was
they could have done that
wild.
from the beginning. Like
Yeah.
yeah.
I was just like, I
Yeah.
guess this movie is very into ACAB because like those people did not need to be there. Like they were not doing their
No.
jobs. Like uh
Yeah.
I
but
mean, if you had this technology available, they probably were like, well, we could do some like boring stuff, or we could do this really cool thing and go into someone's mind. Let's
not
do
to the
that.
Yeah.
point where I read too far into it. And then I was like, I think Vince Vaughn's little buddy, like the other special agent, is in on it
Oh.
and he wants his friend back because I was
Hmm.
like, that was the only thing that could have explained this level of incompetence. And that because, and he was also
Yeah.
being really
I
weird. Like he
mean,
was like, are you okay, dude? And I was like, who is this man? Like he must be in on it. Um,
Yeah.
but
I'm just gonna say that Fred Claus probably shouldn't be in the FBI. So
Fred Claus. Well, also at one point, Vince Vaughn he finds the woman. She did a fantastic job of
Oh
saving her
yeah.
own butt because she like
Yeah.
yeah.
rips open a pipe and she's breathing into it to like give her more time. Awesome. Love to see,
Mhm.
a strong woman. And Vince Vaughn like gets her out of there and immediately pulls her into his lap. And all I could
Yeah.
say was like, if I were ever abducted and an FBI agent saved me, there is never a moment in time where it is appropriate for me to be in his lap. Like that's a no-go for me. It
Yeah.
was
I feel
wild.
like too, like the actress did a fantastic job in that scene too,
Mhm.
like when she sort of fights him because she's in
Yeah.
shock and like, the shock is finally settling in after she follows his instructions and swims back so he can shoot the glass or whatever. And I just thought as an actress, she did a fantastic job in that scene. Um, but yeah, like I feel like in that moment of like she doesn't know any of the plot of the film.
Yeah.
So she doesn't know who the serial killer is. So, like, and obviously up until then, she'd been assuming that she was probably a kidnapped ransom victim or something.
Hmm.
That's the kind of implication, at least. And like then she's rescued by this guy who's like, shown her his badge or whatever. But like, how does she know he's not the fucking serial killer? Like,
Right.
I
I
feel
mean,
like,
at that point, you've got less than an inch of air. You're just like, I guess I gotta trust this.
yeah, I guess that's
Yeah.
true, to be
But
fair.
like again,
Yeah.
I wouldn't want him like hugging me or I would be like, no, no,
Yeah, I
no,
Yeah.
just
still
give
wouldn't
me a
want to be
minute.
comforted in that way.
Like I
Like,
would be like,
I don't
I'm
want
gonna
a
sit over
stranger hug.
here.
Like, sorry.
Yeah. This is the worst time. You're misreading the situation so much, Vince Vaughn.
Yeah. The next scene, the cut scene, of course, at the end of the film is like wedding bells and them getting married. So
Yeah.
A true horror.
Well, no,
yeah.
they do say like, oh, the FBI like kind of excluded mind technology and kind of like brushed it over,
Hmm.
and they're like, no, it didn't really happen. So I did think that was interesting, where they like pulled a no, thank you, we're not going to use
Yeah.
this again, and also
Right.
not give you credit for anything. Um,
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah.
How
It's
did
kind of
everyone feel about the
interesting.
way that like water is portrayed throughout the
Ooh.
movie?
Mm,
Yeah. It's honestly fascinating. So like when I mentioned earlier, like all the stuff with sort of purity and cleanliness, it's
mhm,
connected pretty
Hmm.
clearly to that. Like,
Yeah.
and probably don't need to explain that like water sometimes can symbolize cleanliness or like
Sure. Sure.
purity is probably not something that needs to be explained in too much detail. But it's got this kind of interesting dual function in the movie where because it's simultaneously because it imparts that feeling of weightlessness that
mhm,
Jennifer Lopez talks about as being important to him as somebody with schizophrenia, which, I also want to mention, like, unfortunately, this film falls into one of those kinds of tropes of like serial killer with schizophrenia type movies,
Hmm.
and it does do it a
Hmm.
bit more sympathetically, but caveat that like in real life, people with schizophrenia are much more likely to be the victims of violent crime,
Right.
not the perpetrators.
yep.
And yeah.
Absolutely.
But that said, so she says, like the feeling of weightlessness is something that's comforting to him. At the same time, his first experience of a seizure and of hearing kind of like this, voice, the voice of kind of King Starger, is like during this baptism experience, which is very negative. And there's a lot that the movie is doing, I think, in terms of like audience connotation between sort of like forms of bad religion, quote unquote,
Hmm.
and you know, abuse and
Hmm.
you know, stereotypes around like you know, basically like hillbilly type characters, like that sort of stereotype character, right? Like that's
Hmm.
sort of what's being leaned on to kind of generate that sort of audience response a little bit there. So I think it's important to note that as well. And then that's contrasted. There's a reading of this where it's contrasted later on by so-called quote unquote good religion when he's then baptized a second time with all this Catholic imagery around it. But anyway,
Wild that they brought in the Virgin Mary at the end.
Literally, the
Like, I
Virgin
was,
Mary saves him and brings him
yeah, it
into
yeah.
a pool.
was, yeah, that was a wild swing that I was not expecting at all for her to be like, oh, I see this card of the Virgin
Mhm.
Mary in his
Yeah.
documents, so I am going to make
Yep.
myself his savior.
It's
Uh,
interesting because so in an interview, he apparently like Tara Singh said like he was surprised that people thought that she would look like the Virgin Mary, because he'd been perceiving her as a sort of like Brazilian water goddess. But I think maybe the piece that like I mean that might be an earnest sort of thought on his part, but the fact that like when you look at sort of South American like Christianity.
mhm,
In a lot of places, it's very sort of syncretistic. So it's blending elements of kind of Christian imagery with whatever the indigenous practices would have been there. And then also sort of like the beliefs of people, enslaved people who were brought forcibly to those countries. So like, you know, the Marian imagery could well be also a Brazilian water goddess at the same
Yeah.
time. And like those things don't have to be mutually exclusive. But it's certainly like the immediate visual, like that's what I understood when I saw this when I was younger. That's what every time I've watched this film, I've registered that figure as like, okay, it's Marian imagery that's happening here. Um, until I
what
read the
Wikipedia
review.
says.
I was to say, right on Wikipedia, it says Virgin Mary like figure. And
Yeah.
I guess when I was watching it, I immediately was like, Virgin Mary.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's just like
I
my
could see
Western brain
his
immediately going there, but
I do think he made an argument for that even in the movie because it looks like it's more of like a tarot card or something that she
oh,
views,
okay.
Right.
but also like as someone who was raised in Catholicism, I was like prayer card, like
Yeah, and
Hmm.
because
even the
those
Yeah.
tarot, right?
exist. So yeah,
Like tarot imagery is absolutely inflected by Christian symbolism.
yeah.
And, you know, so I can't do we actually see what the title of that card is? Like, is it
I
the
don't
Empress or
I don't
think
something?
remember.
so. I think it was, I
Yeah.
don't think it had a title because I think I saw it and I was like, well, what exactly is that? And then I saw her and I was like, Mary. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So like that card having Christian imagery on it isn't impossible either, so I don't think it's
Hmm.
totally an escape. Um, but as to the water thing, so you've got on the one hand, it's got this complex sort of dynamic push-pull dynamic going on, where throughout the movie it's associated both kind of in the negative column with this sort of like defining experience that he had. That's the basically the instigation of this terminal illness that
Hmm.
he ends up having. And then on the other hand, it's also kind of like a source of comfort and ultimately is the source of his salvation, whether that's
Hmm.
like lowercase salvation or uppercase salvation in a sort of like Christian sense. Um,
Sure.
yeah,
And even like being able to sail out of this desert like area within
yeah,
their minds, too, the mention of sailing and everything. It is like the path to salvation.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a great point too, because it also appears in the little boy Edward's,
Yeah.
you know, like the lack of water is notable because of course it's a desert. And then also the fact that like he seems to have had like the reason the little boy is in the coma is to do with an accident while
Hmm.
sailing at a beach, or there's something like related to that. And now, you know, she wants to go sailing with the little boy, presumably as like, I guess, would you call it a form of exposure therapy, but is sort of gradually waking
Yeah.
him
Yeah.
up to like, you know, this is what happened, and you can have these positive connotations with water now as well. Like this thing isn't ruined for you.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
This movie, I mean, we're talking a lot about the plot, and I love the discussion, but it also like again, the imagery and the music is so well done. So the music is
Yes.
done by the composer of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. So,
Howard Shore, how dare
Yeah.
you?
Howard Shore. He is an Academy Award winning composer, and it shows because the tension in this movie with the music is just
Yeah.
fantastic,
Mhm.
and it just like it builds and adds so many layers And it
Yes.
like
Yeah.
it
Mhm.
was so good throughout the entire film. Like it puts you on edge in a way where I think like I appreciate Steve what you've been saying about like horror and how like all horror, it should be more expansive and it should be done. But like I feel like the music almost added to the horror elements of it because there isn't
Yeah.
always a ton of horror on the like viewing of like imagery or anything like that, but the tension and the feeling is there and it's done
Yes.
really well with the music.
I would say also though, like the costumes and makeup add a lot to that too, because
Yes.
Yes.
when you're getting the combination of like when Jennifer Lopez is trapped in this King Starger situation where she's essentially like his slave, and we
Hmm.
Yeah.
see this image of her and she's just got this very serious look and she's got this makeup on, and then there's this music. It's like, okay, well, things
Yeah.
have really taken a turn here. I am scared.
Well,
It's
like,
really exquisite costuming, and the costume designer is Aiko Ishioka, who did the costumes for Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. So
Okay.
like
oh, okay.
also stunning, stunning, stunning visual like movie for
Yeah.
visuals.
Hmm.
Like just like utterly gorgeous. Like every piece of clothing in like both those films
Yeah.
just
No,
exquisite.
so good.
It was
Yeah.
honestly like a really beautiful movie to watch, but at the same
Yeah.
time, like it does have these like moments that are like, okay, well that was ick. Like I didn't want to watch Vince Vaughn's intestines being pulled out and when he's
Right.
inside of Starger's mind. But I do think that there are so many moments though that you're watching, and I think the movie, for as short as it is, it doesn't seem rushed, even though
No.
it's a thriller
Yeah.
of sorts, you know. It doesn't seem like it's rushing through anything. It's like we have time within the scene that we feel like we can kind of sit in the moment, and we're kind of, they really do a beautiful job of like letting the actors like walk across the scene and everything. And
Yeah.
I think that that adds a lot to the viewing experience. And I was just really impressed with how well time was used.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's really good at like there's a lot of for a short movie, like you said, like he uses slow-mo a lot.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And he uses it carefully. Like it's not just sort of like slow-mo all the time for the sake of it, but particularly in the dream sequences, because he does use it outside the dream sequences as well. Um it's used to create a sense of kind of like being in the dream, right? Like what
Yeah.
Hmm.
like time sort of not really quite making sense. And there's so much like the way that the scenes are cut too. So like we see her about to chase young Starger, the child, up this sort of phantasmagorical staircase. And then, it cuts to her in the next room, and presumably she's mounted the staircase. We didn't see that happen, but instead of feeling like it was something that like was just skipped over, it feels like no, she started to think about moving toward the room, and then she was just in the room because that's how
Hmm.
Hmm.
dreams work.
Yep.
And so like time and all of that, like it's just really interestingly done.
Well, I think that that also is like the way horror is used in this is very like dream-like, where I think
Yeah.
sometimes in dreams something can be happening that's pretty normal, but something inside your head is unsettled by it and
Oh yeah,
you get
yeah.
freaked out. And I think that happens a lot because there are moments where she's like, well, it's just horrifying what I saw in his head. I can't even believe it. I can't even say it. And then sometimes I would be like, well, what did she see that was like so bad? I'm like, no, but it's the unsettling feeling. Like it is like
Yeah.
incredibly in your mind. And she's witnessing that. And then it just makes you feel unsettled. And I think that that was a really effective way of showing the dream world that it isn't always like right there in your face. Sometimes it is subliminal and in your
Yeah.
mind. And that's hard to do for a movie, but it felt like this
I
one
do
did
think
it
they also
well.
kind of point at that though directly in that Vince Vaughn scene with him just like he's in all this pain and everything and he's still like calling it out like, hey, this isn't real. Like
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
we're not here.
We're not really
We're
here.
not
We're not
really
really here.
here.
Yeah.
So
Unbreakable Kimmy
yeah.
Schmidt.
um, but it was really well done. And like, yeah, the even the like horrific like Vince Vaughn stuff, I feel like that's just as unsettling as when you see like a sheet become sand and you're like, ooh, we just like
Hmm.
Yeah,
shifted and I
yeah.
don't
Yep.
know how.
Yeah, and that's interesting too because like that is a dream. So or
Yeah.
a
Hmm.
trip. She's just smoked some weed. She's watching, Fantastic Planet. Like, she starts staring at her sheets and it becomes
Hmm.
dunes and like, so that's a kind of her own dream at that point. And so that's quite interesting. But you're right, like there's this even though there shouldn't be anything unpleasant about that, and in fact, we're kind of led to believe that those desert landscapes, they have a positive connotation for her.
Yeah.
There's
Hmm.
still this quality of like that nail, like you can just feel the back of your head a little bit like, this itchiness, it's not right. There's something, uncomfortable or unsettling in the way that I think most dreams ultimately are, even ones
Hmm.
that are quite positive. There's always an eeriness. There's always
Yeah.
everything's slightly askew. Like it's not, the picture is not quite
Sure.
straight on the wall.
It's
Um,
also good because they show like how dreams can sometimes happen. Because like we hear like the Mokloke at the beginning where they're like,
mm,
oh, that's who he's fearing. And they're like, how did that happen? Like, what does that come from? And she's like, oh, it's a play on Mother Goose. Like his mind just like couldn't, and we see that in the film too, where you have this like water goddess figure who
mm,
she uses to help heal Carl. Or you see like Vince Vaughn at the end of the movie, he's like in his horror house and he sees the intestine photo that came from like this is how he was thinking of torturing at the time.
right.
And
Yeah.
like I think it's not overdone where every single thing we see has to be something pulled from his house because that would be
Yeah.
No.
too much and like too fantastical. But it's
Yeah.
just enough where we're like, oh yeah, that is how dreams work. Sometimes you talk
Hmm.
about something and then you dream about it that night.
I think
Hmm.
that is one of my favorite things about the movie, and that I think deepens with every rewatch is like the way that sort of parallelism is used
Mm.
throughout the film, because it's there, but it's subtle.
Yeah.
So it's not just like, oh my, like you don't have the characters monologuing and seeing like pointing at something, being like, oh my God, like,
Yeah.
did you see this? This is what you described in the dream, like, which would just totally ruin it.
Sometimes I need that though.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
That, oh, Laura sitting here being like, oh, there was an intestine shot at the end of the movie.
Yeah. But there's like sometimes it's parallels between sort of like the dream space and the real world as well. So like even just something on a broader scale, like the industrial look and feel of his kill site. Like when they
Mhm.
find his kill site in this farm, this old abandoned industrial complex, is kind of echoed in the environments you see, which are given then a fantastical bent inside his mind.
Yeah.
The scene where like we first see him sort of like suspend himself by the back with the chains over the corpse of
Hmm.
the woman that he's killed. And like you see him just before he suspends himself, he has the chains on his back and
Hmm.
he like is wearing them like a cape. And then
Yes.
several scenes later, not immediately because that would be too like obvious, but
Yeah.
later you get the scene with the cape pulling and you see this is what he's imagining in his fantasy. This is
Yeah.
Hmm.
like, he's King Starger when he's wearing those chains and
Mhm.
it's I think that kind of like that subtle kind of placement, the way it's done is very careful and very clever throughout the movie. Um like the repetition of the like when Vince Vaughn first enters into Starger's mind and he kind of awakes in a puddle. So again, we have water. But he's also in this kind of barren field, and you can see the ruts in the field where they'd been
Hmm.
where it was being farmed. And we know that he sort of grew up on this farmhouse, but also we know that like again, his kill site is sort of at this like it's surrounded by this farmland that's like
Yeah.
frequently experiencing drought. So like it's just like embedded in everything. It's all kind of very imbricated
Hmm.
throughout the movie. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. And yeah, I do think it's really effective the way they've, done all those things. I will say again, small nitpicks. Jennifer Lopez saying, "Oh, I bet he loves being suspended. It calms him." When the only time we saw him suspended was him screaming at a corpse in pain. I was like, I
Yeah.
don't think that
Yeah.
was very calming. Actually, I would like to push back on that statement and say that it
Yeah.
doesn't seem calming. You could say it's cathartic, but it doesn't mean that it's calming. Like,
Yeah. I think
Hannah,
that's
I know
fair.
you.
Oh,
Go ahead.
or I was just gonna say, like, I think my other qualm with the movie is I think like not intentionally, but kind of accidentally, it kind of edges into sort of like a bit of an anti-kink space.
yeah, I do
Hmm.
think that
Because
Yeah.
people just like I've got a lot of friends who are like, we're into sort of like rope play and like suspension and stuff like that. And like it's just perfectly neutral, like,
Yeah.
kind of a thing. So here it's like because it's a serial killer who's doing it, it's like I think somewhat unintentionally or like
Yeah.
consciously sort of like linking it with that. So and again, like throughout the movies, to be fair, like sex is kind of like portrayed really only negatively.
Yeah.
We
Hmm.
don't really see any kind of like positive suggestion of like, sexuality. I don't think it's intentional, but it's sort of like is there just beneath the surface a little.
It's
I do
kind of
think
almost like subliminally like they're
Yeah.
not it's not like I don't think they intended for it to be like a major theme, but it's still like
no,
there in
but
the background.
well, I also think like back in 2000, we probably society probably was pretty anti-kink and probably
Hmm.
had a lot of
Hmm.
harmful things going on.
Yeah.
I'm just going to make that assumption right here without
I
studying
think that's
it, but
fair.
Yeah.
I do think that that is a very apt criticism for this, especially when the second we enter Jennifer Lopez's mind, it's literally Virgin Mary
Mhm.
Yes.
like
Yeah. The
identifying
Virgin
where
Mary is
it's like
key.
where like
Yeah.
his mind is dark and there's like there are elements of like sex and deviance, and it's never,
Yeah.
and it's obviously a serial killer, so it's going to be negative and it's not going to be like, it's never
Yeah.
commented on where you could handle that in this movie with Jennifer Lopez being like, well, these parts of him aren't evil necessarily, or have a third person where it's like, oh, it wouldn't be evil if it was just kink. It's evil what he's doing.
Yeah.
But that's never
Yeah.
really commented on. It's just kind of put
No.
under the umbrella of he is deviant and evil. So therefore, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and the audience can be trusted to make assumptions about that. And it's interesting too, looking at audience reactions at the time. So like apparently like, people freaked out quite a lot about this movie, which is funny
Hmm.
to us now, I think, because like as you guys
It
rightly
had a
pointed out,
huge box office turnout though.
oh
Like
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
it seems like it was very popular at the time.
I
Yeah,
mean,
it was,
yeah.
yeah. Like people, I think people went to see it and liked it. It seems like there was a certain amount of critical reception that was sort of very negative toward like the elements that were perceived as being like sexual, because it was like too much or like it was too intense a film, that kind of thing. And it's funny now because like you guys pointed out, like it feels like very light horror. I think like we've
Yeah.
got more used to maybe
Hmm.
seeing sort of more graphic stuff on TV. Although to be fair, I have I read this academic piece about how actually that's a falsity that like we have this idea that TV has got more graphic it
Yeah.
actually hasn't.
Hmm.
But
I
like
don't, yeah,
but
I don't
anyway,
know if it's more graphic. I think, yeah, I think you're right with that because I wouldn't say that this is like, oh, if people saw it way back when, like, I think maybe it's more false or like improper understanding of what this movie was at the time. Cause I pulled up like
right.
still images and like things like that. Like, and I do remember the cover, I think. And I think a lot of people could have walked into this being like sci-fi entering the mind, and they weren't
Yeah.
expecting like art house, like horrific elements and things like that.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of like what is quote unquote palatable depending on like you were talking earlier about like how we package something and how we like market it to people. And so I do feel like when they kind of put a little bit of a Law and Order SVU spin to something like
Yeah.
this, that it does come off as a little bit like, oh, this doesn't feel right. This feels a little sexual to me and stuff. And I do think, Hannah, you're right that if they would have leaned more into like, no, this is like sci-fi. This is like if you like Dune, go watch this. There's deserts here too. Like
Yeah.
I think that that may have helped some of the critical reception of it.
I mean, Roger Ebert did love this movie though. So I do
I
think
mean,
like
same.
it seemed like it was polarizing at the time, like you
Yeah.
said, Steve.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Hannah, you said you
interesting.
didn't enjoy the ending of Stargird. Do you want to delve into that?
Yeah. So it's one of those things where again, I think this just falls back on not liking Jennifer Lopez's style of psychology, where she's like, well, I feel connected to this small child,
Mhm.
and I feel like this small child is like redeemable in whatever shape or form. And I'm just kind of like, okay, but like you're putting, so in this movie, again, the ethics of like putting someone into Jennifer Lopez's mind and the ethics of that and what it could
Mm,
mean and she decides to take it upon herself to bring Starger into her mind in
Yeah.
order to kind of help this small child. And in so doing, this child told her a story about how he killed a bird who he loved because it
Mm-hmm.
needed to be sacrificed to save it from the hands of his father.
Mm-hmm.
And she ends up doing that with quote unquote baptizing the king Starger, and it kills the child, as a connection to that. I didn't quite love that because like the reality of this is it is a psychologist who has a really long life, but like there are questions about how this technology works with her in the beginning because she's having similar dreams to the kid who she's been helping.
Yeah.
A, B, if she wanted to help someone, I don't know why she chose him as like, it just the motivations weren't there for me. And like, see, it feels like his turn had come to an end because there had been kind of like they could have ended it before bringing him into her mind. There wasn't really a need for it other than to show that like she's a caring person. Like I feel like it
Mm.
could have been
But she
handled in
got
his
wildly
mind.
attached like so
Yeah.
quickly.
And again,
I
like sometimes I'm watching and I'm like, okay, but that's still a serial killer. Like I understand being
Mhm.
like kind and empathetic towards people, but at the same time, like you're allowing a serial killer to enter your mind. Like, have you thought about like what if he took over? That's why I was like,
Yeah.
I think the other guy's evil and they're trying to get his brain inside Jennifer Lopez. Like that could work. Like we don't know the, morality of this, and it's not that type of
Yeah.
film, but like it just didn't work for me where we're sitting there like watching her come full circle where I was like, I feel like we could have done this and saved like 10 minutes of the runtime or had 10 minutes inside the mind in other places where
Mm-hmm.
like, and that was also around the time that Vince Vaughn was taking a kidnapping victim into his lap. And I'm like, what is everyone doing in this moment? So like
Right.
that part didn't work as much for me. Um, but I think it was just like a very specific nitpick of her as a
Fair.
psychologist and the full circleness that could have happened earlier inside his own mind. It
Mm-hmm.
felt like kind of putting a hat on a hat in my mind.
I think like I have a lot of thoughts. Like I think like the ethical implications are very tangled there just
Yeah.
from like the perspective of she decides to euthanize this
Yeah.
child. Like
Mm-hmm.
she euthanizes him.
Yes.
He
She
is
has
murdered
no
at the end of it.
oversight. She like,
Yeah,
she
because
kills
you're
somebody.
watching her like go after adult Starger and then or King Starger, and then
Yeah.
every wound that he takes, the young Starger also does, which is a pretty horrifying thing to see. That's one of the
I
Yeah.
mean, at
worst
the
And
end of this
things.
movie, she is a murderer. We can all
yes.
Yeah.
agree.
And she's all walking around fine,
Like,
free, no one's
Yeah.
questioning this. I guess because
yeah.
everyone's like, whatever, we don't care about him. But like,
Well, and
her
that's it. That has
psychologist,
weird implications too, where it's just like, yeah, but also like, we are we just an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? Like, I don't
Right.
know how I feel about
yeah,
that
I
either.
think,
Well, I think the
yeah,
implication is like because she cared so much about the child, he
yeah,
wanted it to happen because he is like the manifestation of pure innocence. And so he doesn't want
yes,
to live inside the
But,
mind with this other person.
but the
And
yeah,
it's
way
like,
that they're
but
just like,
again,
oh, it's fine that she killed a serial killer.
she
We're
did
not
commit
going to talk
murder.
about this.
yeah.
And like she violated so many
She
rules
finally
and
did the
everything.
right
Also
directive.
She
killed a man,
stole
but that's
his
okay. We're gonna give her
she
more projects.
killed a man and took his dog. And we're gonna let that
Yeah.
child get inside that brain.
Oh
Like,
my God.
no.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like I really like the scene. I find it quite moving. Um, I don't know like if that says something about how messed up I am, but it
Never
doesn't.
enter
It
Steve's
definitely
mind.
yeah. As soon as you think about it for like any length of time, it's like somebody in her position just wouldn't do this, right? Like
Yeah.
Hmm.
somebody who's professionally trained, like, and like it's like it makes sense for the character to a point, like in terms of her emotions. It makes
Yes.
sense for me because it's and the way that the movie is also, I would argue, paralleling what she's doing with Starger in that moment with what Vince Vaughn is doing,
Hmm.
rescuing the woman, Starger's victim. So again and again, it's the thing with the water too, right? So like you see the baptism, for him, it's healing, quote unquote, by
Mhm.
euthanizing the child. And then sort of like you see, Starger's victim, Julia, being rescued from the water.
Mhm.
And it happens simultaneously. Those two scenes are cut between. I do like it for the fact also that it sort of like gives back agency to Jennifer Lopez instead of just having like, Vince Vaughn is really not that interesting to me comparatively.
No.
He's just like the dude who's there because like we need to have cops or whatever in the
Hmm.
film. And like he goes, like if the movie was just him rescuing this female victim,
Hmm.
like I think for me it would just start to feel a bit like, every other kind of like, FBI serial killer movie in a little
Right.
bit.
Yeah.
It's still satisfying because like we want to see Julia rescued. And you're right, like she herself is quite agentic actually, even though she doesn't have many lines and doesn't, like obviously she's underwater for a lot of it, so she can't be up to too much. But she's doing stuff, right? Like, she's
Hmm.
trying to escape and things. So we see her being agentic.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's why I like that scene at the same time, sort of having similar or like adjacent problems with the kind of like, but like as a psychologist, she would have been trained not to make this kind of like judgment call right now. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I it's interesting.
The real twist in the story is that she's actually not a psychologist. She's an accountant who
Yeah.
just walked into the wrong department that day.
Oh,
Yeah,
she
yeah.
is. Yeah. And like, it is weird that I feel like the movie, and this is where I was like, well, I feel like we could have had a couple more minutes in his own head and ended it that way.
Mm,
And then you don't need it as much, where like, I think it's the added of like bringing him into the world and doing those things where I was like, well, if it happened like in a different way, I might have liked it better, but it just
yeah,
felt a little bit ham-fisted to be like, oh, we're gonna bring
right.
them into J-Lo's brain.
Yeah.
Um,
Maybe
but
I'm twisted, but I wish we could have had a lot more time in Starger's mind.
yeah, like I
Those are the
think
cool parts.
right, those are
Yeah.
the most amazing parts. And if you have them, then like you can have her still be like an agent. And I also didn't really need Vince Vaughn in there. Like the second they
No.
were like,
Yeah.
well, we used to try to put two people in there for review. And I was like, well, Vince Vaughn is gonna be inside Vincent D'Onofrio's head at some point.
That
Hmm.
also
Um,
didn't make any sense because like naturally like the other psychologist like
well,
Yeah, they're the
who's
they
there
had
trained
would have been like
ones.
the person to go in. Like it's like
they
why
had to
would they let
monitor
this
the
guy like
machines that J-Lo was able to utilize herself. So
Mhm.
like but
Yeah.
yeah, there were just certain parts where I was like, oh, I wish we could have had more of that. And I do think like it was good to have Julia have be someone who had agency and who was like
Yeah.
working to
Hmm.
protect herself because it is amazing to watch like those scenes and the scenes with J-Lo where like she does get stuck in there and has to be helped by Vince Vaughn. But it also makes sense if you're used to the mind of a child and you're going into an adult's brain, like
Yes.
why that would happen. And
Yeah.
yeah, I could have gone without Vince Vaughn going into the head as well, but like
Yeah.
you could have her be tortured herself and be pulled out, and then you're spending
Yeah.
more time in the brain. You're letting her still choose to do it, but like you're taking out some of the like more ham-fisted parts of the movie, I think.
Yeah. I think too like all of what you're saying like touches also on something that again relates kind of to the music. But and just the question you guys raised at the very beginning of like how much of oneself like is in any one like how much of each character is in any one scene, right? So
Yeah.
like the movie like it's very careful throughout. It's interesting. So like the scenes that are in Starger's mind, obviously Jennifer Lopez still has some power like to influence things. And one way that that's indicated in the movie I noticed was through music. So like we hear the music that's playing at the very beginning of the film when she's in the dream with the child, playing in Starger's mind. The only way that's possible is if it's something she's producing. So she's bringing it into both the child's mind and then also Starger's mind. And similarly at the end, when Starger's in her mind, like if she was in total control, the child would just be there, right? Like she'd be able to take the child into her mind. She could just like hang out with him there and like give him a break from like, the sadistic boogeyman who beats him up inside his own head. But she's not able to totally do that. The monster follows him
Mhm.
and is able to like impact the environment. So we see the environment darken visually. Suddenly the water has a snake in it. It's full of creepy crawlies appear on the child's hands, things
Hmm.
like that, right? She's not making that happen. Rather, it's the force of this other person's will that's doing it. And so I found that really interesting, the way that like music indicates that, but also sort of like what it's playing with in terms of like how much any one given person is in control in these scenarios. And then like the feedback, like it just raises a lot of quite interesting in-world questions about sort of
Yeah.
like the nature of our minds and how we like,
And free will also too.
yeah.
That's so strange. Yeah, this movie is just fascinating. I'm so excited that we got to watch it because it's so many different layers. So,
Did anybody have
Yeah.
like a favorite part?
uh, I really the scenes where we get to see like King Stogger at the beginning, where like you
Yeah.
see the like the bird cape or the giant like
Yes.
curtain capes coming down, like it's
Yes.
so
Spectacular.
cinematic yet so
Yes.
spectacular and big, and it's just like that director really ate with those scenes. Like you're just
Yeah.
watching just like pure art, and I feel like that's where you're still horrified because you're so unsettled, but it's
Hmm.
also
Yeah.
just gorgeous, and it does like bring this to a level where I'm not shocked that like the makeup got nominated for an Academy Award, where you're like, oh yeah, this was
Yeah.
something. It wasn't just like a J-Lo monster-in-law rom-com.
Hmm.
like, uh but
Yeah, I
yeah.
think that those are great scenes, and I think like the one that immediately pops to mind is that one with the cape as well, and the music is also going hard at that point. Like it's got this really imperial element to it, so it's like
Yeah.
evoking kind of imperial Rome, and like it's like very much like this is like this manly like warped vision of manliness that he's sort of aspiring to that is in absolute control here and is utterly terrifying. Um, and like when I think what he yells at her is like, "Where do you come from?"
Yeah.
Like, and it's this distorted, really loud voice, and it's just like, yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
What
yeah,
about you,
Yeah, I
Laura?
also have to say that the King Starger, like anytime King Starger was on the screen was probably my favorite. I just really enjoyed that whole portrayal.
Well,
yeah.
like there's so many elements where Stalker is really good in like the horror elements, where there are moments where he like harkened back to it with like his like somersaulting and things like that, where I was like, oh, this is
Mhm.
very much like it, the bogeyman, like things that go bump in the night. It was
Hmm.
giving all those different feelings. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's like this was in an interview that I read today with Tarsem Singh, and it was really interesting because it actually sort of put into words better like than I could something I was trying to articulate the other day on Blue Sky. So I was like talking about like sometimes like editorially, like the piece of feedback I will have the most sort of like mental internal pushback against is when like I know I've put something in there early on um that seems inconsequential, but it's in order to make the audience feel a certain way later.
mhm.
And like I can't it's usually just something that seems unrelated, but it's to put the audience in a particular frame of mind about something in the story. And so I was reading this interview just like casually, and then he lo and behold Simpson kind of said something similar. And what he said was um so for the scenes later in the movie where like the clown-ish sort of like, carnival-esque costumes, and King Starker is wearing those. Um, he was very aware that like an audience watching those scenes done poorly would laugh at them.
Mhm.
And so you needed to feel a certain way about the character beforehand in order not to laugh and to find them frightening. And so, like, apparently, like, he was very emphatic about keeping, like, a lot of the really disturbing stuff about Starger earlier on, where we see, like, him bleach the bodies of these women,
Yeah.
and we see him suspend himself and all of that stuff. And it's really quite raw and, like, like he's having a sexual experience, like, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
We're meant to feel uncomfortable about this. Um, and it's those that allow the audience not to laugh. And he said they actually showed, like, originally those scenes were cut out of the movie because executives wanted them cut. And then they did show it to a group of people, and that audience did laugh later at the like kind of clownishness, like those over the top elements. But then subsequently, and so the executives were like, "Oh yeah, just let him put it back in then," and then he put it back in, and the same problem didn't recur. So like that kind
That's
of thing.
fascinating, honestly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Wow.
interesting.
Well, I'm looking at Tarsim's like line of work. hilarious that he directed Mirror Mirror. Just very funny. I watched that movie, would not have put these two on the same level. Lily Collins and Julia Roberts, slapstick Snow White retelling. But
Yeah.
looking at that, like there is something, and this is where I say, like, I'm new to horror, but there's something about it that like it kind of entices me. And I have to find that weird line between like, ooh, too scary, I can't sleep, and like something that I'm
Yeah.
really interested in. He directed Emerald City, which was a TV show I was obsessed with when it came out, and I was
Oh.
devastated that it got canceled. And that one was like a weird Dorothy and Oz as like an adult retelling.
Oh, I saw
And
bits of that.
yeah,
Yeah.
and like the witches were like cardinal witches of like west, north, east, and like they had these like sects of people, and it was like really, really weird and creepy and like unsettling. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's that he really eats when he does stuff like this, because like I loved that show, and it also had Vincent D'Onofrio in it. So there you go. Like,
There we go.
yeah,
That's awesome.
yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. So sort of like phantasmagorical and the surreal. Like I think he does really well, and it's both like beautiful and terrifying, and he's very good at finding like the beauty in terror and the terror in beauty too. Like because
yeah,
there's some scenes in this movie that it's like that is absolutely stunning, but it's something genuinely horrific.
right,
So it's like when Jennifer Lopez is sort of like under his control and stuff. And she
hmm,
has this
Mhm.
gorgeous mask and this gorgeous dress, and the scene is just all gorgeous.
Yeah, and
But
everything
it's,
looks beautiful, but it's like a horrific moment. Like, oh no, we're
yeah,
trapped.
yeah, it's so threatening, right? Like it's, yeah.
like in Her in the Box. Like I think about that
Hmm.
moment where like
Oh,
she's just
yeah.
really unsettled, and then she has to see this like horror show of what's in his mind, and it's just like there's so many different layers. It's very impressive.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
They really are. One I'd recommend like checking out his movie The Fall.
okay.
Um, it's not a horror movie, but it like it's similarly very visually intense. And it was sort of like, he talks about it like this is my baby. This is like,
Wow.
my favorite thing I've made kind of a thing. It seems like very much it was his heart project that he had to kind of get out in the world. And
Lovely
I was really
pace.
impressed
So
by it. I think like The Cell to me is still like my favorite, but but The Fall is very good as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
for
I
me,
greatly enjoyed The Cell, so
yeah.
I will take that recommendation for the fall.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts or anything we haven't discussed yet?
Oh, I like I can talk about this endlessly, which is probably obvious. I hope this is actually an interesting episode to people. Like I just like I have all these notes here like when Starger turns off on the light, the scene changes, our perception of the scene changes, and we like see things closer to his perspective. I don't know,
Hmm.
just like
Hmm.
everything. Yeah, lots of notes about the music. The fact that Valentine, I wondered if Valentine the dog was named Valentine because Saint Valentine is actually a patron saint of epileptics. And like
Oh.
one of the cops in the movie like makes a crack like ha 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 he called his dog Valentine and look he
Hmm.
murders women kind of thing. But I
Hmm.
think we're meant to take that a bit sort of like that's kind of gross in a way, but I think maybe underneath that as a sort of additional layer is like, no, perhaps like he called his dog that because his dog is this grounding, positive thing in his life. I don't know.
Hmm.
Possibly me reading something in that's not there, but
I
And
was terrified
neurological
at the
conditions
beginning.
related.
I was terrified at the beginning when he uses the dog as a way to get a woman out of her car so he could
yeah.
abduct her. I thought he might have let her hit the dog. And I had
Oh
never
No, the
been more
dog's just a
no.
relieved
great actor.
to see the wood block or the stone block behind it, where I was like, no. And
Yeah.
then I was like, okay, thank God that they thought this through. So,
Yeah.
um, but I do think the dog was an interesting added element because it does add
Hmm.
some humanistic qualities to it. Because I think it was like, it's a hard line to walk when you're watching a serial killer do horrific things and not be on his side, but then be asked to like care about his child self. And I do
Right,
think like
right.
having the dog or having him like as a lover of animals was an interesting way to make sure that he was grounded.
It's
Or
so
like,
funny because I was just talking about this recently with someone. We're talking about like, the state of the world. And I had made the comment that I think people have more empathy for animals than they
mhm,
do for people. And I feel like
Right.
that is a very like pointed example of that
yeah,
where this person really cares for this dog and
Yeah.
does
Yeah,
not
for
have
sure.
that same caring for other
Yeah.
humans.
Well, we
Yeah.
do get like I think that was a good way of showing it, and also like the look into the like flashbacks through his own brain.
Hmm.
And it was interesting to me that like for a movie in 2000, I thought it was really effective. And I was trying to think of like if this got made, would this be the same scene where there are
Mm,
some awful things happening, but they're happening in the background. So we hear something
yeah.
about like about his dad like making him and we do see this part where he has to interact with this adult woman. It's awful. But then
Yeah.
Hmm.
J-Lo is like hiding her face and you hear in the background and it's like musical, so you can't really hear it. You have to be listening, but you hear what else is going on and it's awful.
Yeah.
And I thought that was like interesting because it's letting us into the world, but we don't have to watch it. And this is where it goes
Hmm.
back to like, is the world more graphic? Where I'm like, well, in 2025, would we have had to see that? Where like I preferred it the way it was because I liked
Hmm.
the added element of we know what happened
Hmm.
Yeah.
and we're still, but like the main focus in that moment is J Lo experiencing these things happening
Yes.
and
Yeah.
trying to help this child, even though she
Hmm.
knows she's inside his mind and it's not real.
Absolutely. I think it's more powerful actually not seeing it because
Yeah.
like, some of the things that maybe we can describe are like he gets burned by an iron
Yeah.
and like his dad burns him with a like an iron you'd use to iron clothes and we hear him being hit by a belt. We don't see it. We see the father approaching. We know what he's going to do. We hear like young starter scream and we see Jennifer Lopez's reaction and the camera's
Mhm.
very close on her. And she does a marvelous job, I think, emoting. Like all of the scenes where she cries, I was so impressed. Like it was
Yeah.
so authentic. And they do this kind of like almost homage to like David Lynch and Blue Velvet, where you have
Mm.
her looking through the closet slats in the closet
Hmm.
at the scene. And she's sort of like it becomes kind of like I don't mean this in a queer way, like, but it's gonna sound like, but like trapped in the closet she can watch these things happening in his memory. She can't stop the fact that they happened because they are already done.
Yeah.
Like she is
Hmm.
powerless, right, in these moments, and that's almost the more horrific part of it, is the awareness that this terrible thing is happening. Um, and like the awareness that this kind of terrible shit happens all the time to people in the real world, but we aren't able to do anything about it. Like that kind of like frustration that you feel from her is very,
Yeah.
I almost feel like too, just like us as viewers not being able to see it does make it more terrifying that
Yeah.
it's
yeah,
occurring.
yeah, yeah. Because I think it also might cheapen it. It runs the risk of like if you show it, and this is not it's not true of all like gory or
If you
brutal
show
scenes,
it, then
but
we see it play out. If you don't show it, us as viewers, we have to use our imagination, and we're immediately going to go to
yeah.
the worst spot.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's more effective, but also I think it stops it from feeling like it's exploitative.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, and like I'm not anti-gore in films by any means, like, but I think there's certain like in certain scenes and in certain movies and stories, it's just going to be really gross if like in a sort of ethically gross way if you show
Yeah,
it. And in others it won't be, but it's very dependent. And here I think it's far preferable not to show it. Yeah.
Yeah.
agreed.
Yeah. So
Any
yeah.
other thoughts?
No.
Well,
It's
we
like
do recommend
that's
seeing this
awesome.
movie, it sounds like.
Yes,
I
highly
think it's very
recommend.
stunning. It's a
Yes.
good look. Even if you're a scaredy cat horror fan, go watch it because it
Yeah.
is amazing. I will say that my husband had to bow out. He was like,
I mean, look up
this
content
is
Aw.
not my
warnings. I
movie."
mean,
And he was like, "I'm gonna go to bed." I was like, "Sounds good, have fun." Um, but yes, very unsettling, very effective. Uh,
Yeah.
well, Steve, thank you so much for
yes.
joining us. Would you mind telling our listeners something you're reading, watching, and or enjoying right now?
Of course, I like posted this on like Blue Sky, and then like now I've like forgotten immediately. So I'm okay, yeah. So I started a trans reading group. I have an in-person version and an online version. And so our first book for that is River Solomon's Unkindness of Ghosts, which is a kind of like
Oh.
sci-fi dystopia.
Mhm.
It's really hard hitting. It's really good. I definitely recommend that. I'm also reading Rhea Rollman's A Queer History of Newfoundland. Newfoundland's the province I grew up in. But it's worth a read. It's full of all kinds of like cool. I shouldn't just say cool. That sounds really flippant. It's full of all kinds of really important, anecdotes, people's recounts of like their lives growing up in small communities, outpoor communities in Newfoundland as queer people throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. And it's not dry at all. It's really fascinating. So I'd recommend both of those. Otherwise, like I am trash and I'm currently watching Love is Blind season
Oh my
8.
gosh. No,
Hannah
that's
asked
no
me to
shame.
watch it because I've watched all the other, well, not all the other seasons. I haven't watched 7 or 8 now, and I'm
Yeah,
like, I gotta get caught up on this. I just
It's
gotta
okay.
bring myself to do it.
I don't watch Love is Blind. I don't have any problem with
good
people
for
who
you.
do. This is not anything. This is not me like discussing people's worth on because I think all TV shows have value as long as you're not saying like this is the most important like it's whatever. Everything is
Yeah,
a spectrum, and I watch more Law and Order than I would care to admit to, and I do
nice.
often
Oh,
admit
fun.
to on the podcast. So,
Yeah, I grew
um,
up on Law and Order, so like,
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
Law and Order is very effective. The original Law and Order was doing
yes,
something, and then it continued
yes,
on for 25 years, and it became doing nothing. And then
yeah,
Law and Order SVU just did absolutely nothing.
It's
yeah.
about
But
Elliot and Olivia,
and
is
how
what we,
Elliot is really bad at his job, and
and so is
it
Olivia.
yes, it created my
Hmm.
favorite between Olivia in SVU and Meredith Grey and Grey's Anatomy. It created a trope that I talk about quite frequently, which is maybe it's time for you to quit your job, because in these
Hmm.
dramas, like stuff happens to women so often that there are moments where I'm like, I think it's just time for you to quit your job. Like you've been on the show too long, and too like in reality, you would have retired because this is too much trauma for one
Yeah,
human
yeah.
being. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I do
but
remember a friend telling me there's a scene in like part in Grey's Anatomy where like a plane crashes and then one of them gets eaten by wolves or something.
I don't know if someone gets eaten by that might have been One Tree Hill where they get eaten by wolves, but it could have happened.
Okay.
And Grace, I stopped watching Grey's Anatomy so
Cool.
long ago.
I haven't seen
Um,
either, so
but like it goes on for so long, there is a plane crash. And it is a wild time that you're just like,
cool.
how did this happen? But yeah, so many weird things happen. But Love is Blind, I wanted to know one of the spoilers, and then TikTok told me what the spoiler was, and guess what? It was nothing. So
Well,
it
that's
was
usually
less
the
than
case because
nothing.
nothing
Yeah.
happens on that show. It's just like really bland people like dating
Hmm.
other bland,
Yeah.
people who are just there to be famous on Instagram.
I
Like,
am on the side of TikTok of Minneapolis people making fun of who's on Love is Blind because it's all people who like know
oh,
each other where they're like,
gotcha. Oh my God.
we're like
They do that every season where you like find on Reddit or wherever where people are like from those communities that they pull them from. Because I know specifically with season 2, it was in Chicago,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
that there were people from Chicago that were like, yeah, I knew them from such and such, or I saw them at this or that.
Because normal, yeah. So people in Minnesota were like, "Oh yeah, that guy like sleeps with people and leaves his YouTube card for people to like check out and
Oh
subscribe."
my
Like,
Oh my
gosh.
God. Oh my
That's
God.
really
so
cringy.
that
Uh,
is that's the side of TikTok I'm on, but I don't actually watch the show. I just like to have the tea afterwards.
that's fair, yeah.
But no, I think it sounds great that you're watching Love is Blind. But Laura, you don't need to watch season 8 anymore. You can do it on your own
Good.
time. I figured out what happened, and the spoiler is nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing,
Okay,
yeah.
well, maybe I don't have to watch it at all.
Yeah. It's also just a
Exactly.
bunch of like really identical looking like white dudes. Like all of the dudes look the same.
They look
Like
so similar. And it's not
it's
like Minnesota
crazy.
doesn't have people of color there. They just
Yeah.
only hired the same man 6 different times.
Yeah. I was like
Um,
very confused watching it. And granted, I wasn't paying super a lot of attention because I never pay that much attention when
You
I'm
don't
watching
have
Love
to
is
pay that
Blind,
much
but
attention to that show.
well, also,
no.
that's when it
Yeah.
becomes important to cast people who look differently because this is like
Exactly.
Netflix has gone on the record that they know people are multitasking on their shows. So, like, know
Yes.
that people are multitasking and hire people who you can tell who they are.
Which
When
is
Um,
like
5 of them get book deals, then we'll be able to tell them apart. That one's the blue book. That one's the green book.
yes. Yeah. Oh my
Well,
God.
Steve, you are also an amazing author, an indie author. So you
Mhm.
can
Oh,
you
thank
tell
you.
everyone a little bit about your books, where you can find them online and where they can
Yeah.
find you online?
So yeah, so I have two books out. One is a queer horror comedy called The Erstwhile Tyler Kyle. Um, and that is available in paperback and as an ebook. Um, yeah, like I think it's pretty campy and like that kind of thing. It's similarly got kind of strong visual moments, and I think owes a lot to like um I guess like fiction that sort of like plays with dream and stuff like that, but probably more so I'd say David Lynch rather than Tarsem Singh, to be honest. The Wings of Ashtaroth is my epic fantasy though, and that like I like has a lot of like Tarsem Singh, the Cell kind of like imagery running through it. That one's only available as an ebook. But it's about sort of like a secondary world, like Carthaginian inspired city that has like Faustian bargains, so bargains with a demon and like lots of backstabbing and like Game of Thrones style stuff, politicking and things. And I'm not many places online anymore. I've kind of like shrunk my presence since like
Good for you.
Yeah.
everyone turned out to be Nazis. So I'm really only on Blue Sky now. At If you just search Steve Westenra, you'll find me and stuff. And I review books on Before We Go blog. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, it
That's
looks
great.
like you recently read one of our books from one of the authors we interviewed last year, K.E. Andrews, Hills of Heather and Bones. So,
Yes. Yeah. Nice. Oh
well,
my God. So good.
it's
Yeah.
amazing that we've gotten to have you on. Everyone should go.
Thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah.
For the
Thank
great
you.
movie rec.
This is
Thank
a
you for
great
having
movie
me. I
rec.
hope it wasn't too dry.
No, it was amazing.
No.
You were amazing. You're welcome back anytime. We really appreciate it. Everyone, go get Steve's book.
Yes.
Check out his interview with me over on
Yeah.
the website, because you can find us everywhere at OWWR Pod. And you can check out ourpod.com for that interview. So you are welcome back, of course, anytime. But thank you for being here today.
Thanks,
Bye.
Steve. Bye.
Bye.